As I mentioned, China, of course, is playing now a key role, and China clearly is not in denial, since we are talking about denial. How is China looking at this conflict? Where does its own interest lie, and how could it influence the way that this conflict moves forward? We have a very special guest today to talk about this topic. So to discuss this, we're joined by a very special guest who is going to give us a perspective which is extremely important and critical at this particular time, and more so for the Pakistani audience, and also to gel in with the way that we are looking at this conflict. My guest today is Ms. Claire Chu. She's joining us from Washington, D.C. She's a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub. She's also a senior China analyst at Jane's in Washington, D.C. She is on the Jane's Geoeconomic Influence and Threat Intelligence team. Ms. Chu's research focuses on national security implications of China's global economic activity, including foreign direct investment and capital flows, and the role of the private sector in China's economic and financial statecraft. Ms. Claire Chu, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Okay, so we've been discussing this ongoing conflict in Iran, and I want to bring you in on this special relationship that China and Pakistan have, and this relationship, of course, came into focus just a couple of days back when Pakistan's foreign minister went to Beijing, had a detailed discussion with the Chinese foreign minister, Mr. Wang Yi, where he briefed him on the negotiations that had taken place and consultations that had taken place in Islamabad between the foreign ministers of Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and of course Pakistan. And then after that, Pakistan and China issued a joint declaration also, a joint statement also, outlining their view of how peace can return to this conflict. So we haven't heard much about China's direct interest in how this conflict is shaping up. How do you think China is looking at the situation, where it stands?
Absolutely. I mean, there has been a lot of discussion about what China might want, China's potential role in a peace negotiation process. But from China's side, there has been pretty cautious messaging so far. So the Chinese government has remained relatively silent on the current conflict. The messaging has been carefully coordinated with other nations, including Pakistan, Bahrain, Gulf countries. And this cautious approach is likely not going to change anytime soon because China's relationship with each of these countries is very important. And China has a relationship with Iran. China has economic interests and strategic interests in Iran. But at the same time, China has strategic and important economic interests in Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Kuwait, and many of the countries that have been struck by Iran in the conflict as well. And so part of China's messaging, it hinges on condemning the strikes against Iran and against other countries in the region, but also avoiding any sort of commitment to military intervention or any sort of public support for the Iranian regime in any sort of defensive or retaliatory sense. So China is sort of balancing this messaging with its reassurance to Gulf states, which again, receiving end of large-scale attacks. So that's one of the reasons why we're not hearing as much from China directly, other than with joint statements with third countries.
But Ms. Chu, this as you're saying that China is not involving itself directly, but relationship will come into focus. And when I say this relationship, I mean China and the US, because President Trump is now scheduled to visit China in May. And there is a lot of commentary in Western media, in American media, that President Trump wants to wrap up this war before he reaches Beijing and has a meeting with President Xi. So whatever needs to happen, needs to happen before that visit takes place. Do you think this is connected? Do you think that from President Trump's point of view, his China visit should happen when the war is over? Is that a major factor?
I don't know if it is the key factor because there are a lot of issues on the table that the US and China are looking to discuss and come to agreement on. But it is possible that China will want to include the Iran issue in its package demands, especially concerning energy security and other commodities based topics. But in general, the upcoming meeting, whenever it is scheduled between Trump and Xi, it could play out in many ways because there are so many scenarios and timelines for how the conflict could end. And even in a scenario that appears favorable to the US and Israel, in which Iran's military capacity is completely degraded, from Israel's perspective, there is no guarantee that Iran will not pursue nuclear development, even with intense diplomatic efforts. And because Israel views Iran as an existential threat, it's unlikely that there will be a permanent resolution so long as existing Iranian regime survives in some shape or form. But at the same time, if the regime were to collapse, it could be replaced by a more hardline government. It could also lead to chaos and internal conflict. And so either way, regardless of how the conflict ends, the likelihood of long-term instability in the region is quite low. And so China is looking to steer clear of further engagement before the situation becomes clear.
But how is it possible, or do you think it's possible that China can actually steer away from all this conflict? And I say that because the Chinese dependence on oil from this region is something which is a fact. And therefore, the early resolution of this conflict is in China's interest. If this war drags on, or if there is no permanent solution to this conflict, do you think China will be looking at other options for its energy requirements? And are there any other options, or is China now completely dependent on the flow of oil from the Persian Gulf?
I mean, China does have reserves and has been very concerned about the issue of security for a very long time. And so China has been preparing for many years to diversify not only its sources of energy and its energy mix, but also transit routes for its energy imports, whether those are maritime or land. China has been investing in pipelines, in bunkering facilities, and also in new energy technologies, right, across the globe. And so this is a scenario that is certainly not optimal for China, but one that China has anticipated with its current dependence on various maritime chokeholds to points in the region. And so even as China is grappling with this, there have been, from China's point of view, some successful relation with Iranian counterparties. We have seen some Chinese vessels permitted to transit the Strait of Hormuz with payment, but larger ship owners are still cautious about attempting passage.
Ms. Chu, I want to get your analysis on this overall geopolitical situation which is now evolving. I've spoken to a lot of people, a lot of experts also from the US, and there is a widespread belief now that the world will look very different after this conflict comes to an end, and that the US position or status as a sole superpower is under threat. It's going to diminish, and when it happens, then the new dynamics would see countries like China and Russia playing a larger role in the world in wake of this conflict. Is that something that you agree with, and how how would China be looking at its own role once this conflict comes to an end?
I mean, even before the conflict, and this is, I think China absolutely does perceive this as, of course, a risk, right? But also a very strategic opportunity to position itself as an alternative world leader. And some of the messaging that we've seen come out of China, China is saying that they are unlike the United States. They do not create problems, they solve problems. They are in favor of arbitration, of mediation. You can no longer trust American diplomacy, right? These are some of the things that China is communicating to countries around the world. And pivot to the Middle East has been quite comprehensive as well. In recent years, we've seen both the Shanghai Cooperative Organization, SCO, and also the BRICS organization extend their geographical scope to the Middle East, including not just Iran, but also Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE as partners, as members. And this expansion really reflects Beijing's intentions to not only play peacemaker in the region, but also it's informed by Beijing's perception of increasingly threatening external security environment. And this conflict is validating Beijing's perception. And so, as these sorts of geopolitical crises, many of which involve supply chain and economic security issues, continue to play out. I think it will be increasingly important for countries like China and like Russia, like Iran, that have been increasingly locked out of Western economic systems to work more closely together and to develop alternative trade routes, alternative financial systems, alternative platforms to continue to engage and to sustain their countries. And so I think we will see a lot more bilateral, both multilateral platforms and systems appearing that do not include the United States or other Western nations, because there will be preparation for the conflict or whatever comes next. And China is seeing how Russia is responding to sanctions and is also protecting itself against sanctions. And we've seen how Iran is protecting against sanctions as well by weaponizing its existing resources and economic leverage. So there will be different roles, whatever the conflict falls.
Ms. Claire Chu, thank you very much for joining us and giving us your perspective about how China is now looking at this situation. We will now take a short break, but when we come back, we will have a very interesting presentation for you about how petrol pricing is done in Pakistan.